I'm Shahar, and as always, it's a pleasure to join JBS's very own David Harris on defending Israel. Amidst Israel's war against Hamas in Gaza, the world has seen a significant rise in anti-Semitism and the targeting of Jews and Jewish communities worldwide. At the same time, much has been happening in the international arena, with a special focus on the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNWRA, some of whose members took part, as I'm sure you've heard correctly, took part in the atrocities and massacre against Israel. We all share a deep feeling that something has got to change. But what exactly and how? David, I'm so thrilled you're here to share with us your insights and hopefully some answers to these tough questions. You recently penned an op-ed in the New York Post, the title of which was "Support for UNRWA Condemns Any Prospect of Israeli-Palestinian Peace." Would you provide our viewers with some historical background and context, yes, I am using that word, about the establishment of UNRWA, how it came to be?
Absolutely, Shahar. But first, if you'll allow me, I want to be sure that JBS viewers know a very important piece of information about you. And that is, how many JBS viewers actually know what Shahar means in Hebrew? I want to be sure they know, not just as a language issue, but because to me it offers hope. Every time I see you, Shahar, the word Shahar in Hebrew means dawn. It's the dawn of a new day. It's the dawn of a new era. So for me, you symbolize that. So thank you for helping me.
Honored. I'm honored.
Now we go from dawn to the dark clouds.
Dawn to dusk. Exactly.
So we have to dial back for a moment, Shahar, to remember that there didn't have to be a war of independence in 1948. It could have been avoided. November 1947, the UN General Assembly met in New York City and voted on a proposed partition plan. It did not give the Jews everything they wished for. It did not give the Arabs everything they wished for, but the Jews were pragmatic and said half a loaf is far better than no loaf if you're hungry. And the Arabs said, even if we're hungry, no loaf is better than half a loaf. So the result was that Israel was created and the Arabs went to war against this new state. And what happens in war, Shahar? And I'm not being glib. It happens in every war. Refugees are a consequence of war. 5 Arab armies started a war. They shouldn't be shocked that refugees are one of the results of the war. And for those refugees there, the United Nations created in 1949, it was operationalized in 1950, a specialized agency called UNWRA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNWRA. By the way, in the same year, 1950, that this went operational, the UN created the UNHCR. I know this is a lot of acronyms. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees.
Right.
And UNHCR had within its jurisdiction refugees from all over the world, including those who were still resulting from the Second World War, except for Palestinian refugees. And I'm not even mentioning, Shahar, a third refugee population, and that is the refugees, Jews from Arab countries.
Now, hold on for a minute, David. Just so that before, I don't want to get confused. I just want to understand what you just told me. You just said that in 1950, we had 2 refugees agencies created by the United Nations, one dedicated for Palestinians, UNRWA, and the other one dedicated for all of the rest of the refugees of the entire world?
Correct.
How is that even possible? How does that happen? Isn't it incredibly unfair to people around the world that you have Palestinians on the one hand and everybody else on the other?
Shahar, wait, it gets worse. This is only the beginning of the story.
I can always count on you for optimism. Yep.
By the end, if your blood pressure was 120/70 at the beginning of the show, it's going to skyrocket. I'm warning you. And viewers, the same.
Beware.
So, okay, So difference number one that we're talking about now, if we ask Manishtana Halayla Hazet, but in these terms, why are Palestinian refugees different than all other refugees? Number one, because they have a separate agency, only for themselves, with a separate budget, a separate bureaucracy, and a separate mandate. All other refugees in the world come under the jurisdiction of UNHCR, the High Commissioner for Refugees, okay? That's number one. Number two, there is no mandate to resettle Palestinian refugees, Shahar. If you look at the mandate of UNHCR for the rest of the world, the mandate is to take care of them in temporary housing, social services, medical care,
Right.
counseling,
Right.
but the goal is to resettle them. Remember, Palestinians are not the first refugees in the world, nor are other refugees that we speak of now. There were refugees before, there are refugees since. But the UNWRA, the UN Relief and Works Agency, has no mandate to resettle Palestinian refugees. So that's a second huge difference, Shahar.
Huge difference. It's like perpetualizing. It's the eternal refugees.
Because that brings me then to the third big difference. Palestinian refugees, by definition, are designated in perpetuity. Meaning, we're not just talking about the original refugees from the War of Independence. Again, I need to stress, the result of a war that the Arab world started, that did not have to be. Had they accepted the two-state solution proposed by the United Nations, there would have been two states living side by side. There might have been some exchange of population, but that's quite different. India and Pakistan had a major exchange of population in 1947. Greece and Turkey earlier in the 20th century, but they went to war. So the third big differentiator, Shahar, is perpetuity. So to really make a fine point of this, for those viewers who have heard of Bella and Gigi Hadid,
Right.
these young fashionistas, models who grew up in Los Angeles in a wealthy family, under the UNWRA definition, they are counted in the refugee population, I have to presume, because it is in perpetuity. By the way, even their father, whose family left because according to what they said to the Washington Post some years ago, they did not want to live under Israeli rule. That's their right. But does that ipso facto make them into refugees because they chose to leave Israel and move to Lebanon and then move to Syria, wherever they went? So three big differentiators, but there's also a fourth, Shahar. And this brings us to today. UNWRA, like the UN itself, is supposed to be neutral.
Right.
UNWRA, as we saw before October 7th, but especially since October 7th, is clearly not neutral. At least many who work for UNWRA, many of the textbooks, many of the classrooms, many of the facilities have now been shown repeatedly by Israel, which is operating in Gaza, have shown the world the evidence. If you in New York on 43rd Street and 1st Avenue, UN headquarters, if you thought that UNWRA was neutral, come spend a couple of hours with us in Gaza. You'll see how unneutral it really is. So now we have all of these issues that have come to the fore. The fact that UNWRA personnel have not been neutral, that facilities have been linked to terror infrastructure, that classrooms have been teaching hatred of Jews, of Zionism, of Israel, that this is a problem in perpetuity, it's not a one-generational phenomenon, and that there is no mandate to resettle. So Shahar, again, another obvious question. Why are there UNWRA refugee camps in Gaza? Israel left Gaza in 2005. for the last 19 years, Gaza has been run by Palestinians, not Israelis.
Hamas government.
So why are there Palestinian refugees in a Palestinian-governed territory,
right,
which is not in dispute? Israel has no aspirations to return to Gaza and rule it. Why? This is all part of the perpetuity. And the last thing I want to say, Shahar, the last thing is, what does all this mean? These are not just talking points. What this means is that for generation after generation, Palestinians have been conditioned, have been in a way educated to believe that their situation is temporary, but the next step is not a new life in Canada or in the UAE or in the United States. The next step is Israel.
Right.
That they are being kept in this situation with the eventual intention of, in their minds, going to Israel, displacing Israelis, ousting Israeli rule, and taking Israeli land for themselves. And that's why the conflict we speak of, when everyone talks about all of the issues, the settlements, the division of Jerusalem, very, very difficult issues, Shahar. You know this yourself as a former Israeli diplomat. But the mindset of even young Palestinians being led to believe that they were displaced, they will return one day, they will take what they believe is theirs, and they will oust Israelis, is a key part of this conflict.
You know, David, you have said so many things, blood pressure going up very quickly, but it's a lot to absorb. So I want to go back for a minute to one of the first points you made, and I just want to understand from you. In 1950, the world decides to establish two agencies to deal with refugees, one for Palestinians and one for the rest of the entire world, every conflict, every situation. Regardless of the Israeli-Palestinian discussion, narrative, conflict, this should be antagonistic towards the world. Like, a lot of people around the world should be upset about this, asking, why you and not me? Why not refugees from Darfur? Why not refugees from other conflict areas around the world? Why should the Palestinians be treated in such a different and special way when they get their own staff, their own agency, their own budget? How come this has been a non-issue for what, 73 years, 74 years now, David?
I think the answer begins with the fact, Shahar, that the mandate of UNWRA was a very different mandate than the mandate of UNHCR.
Why? But why? How is this allowed?
Because the international community accepted the notion that Palestinians were temporarily displaced and therefore would presumably return rather than be resettled in third countries. Had the Palestinian population been mingled with everyone else, then it would have been impossible to sort this out. So instead, two agencies, as I said, two budgets, two staffs. The UNRWA budget, by the way, is quite big, if not bloated. The staff is huge, including many local Palestinians, which created even more opportunity for the complicity that we saw since October the 7th among some of those staff. By the way, there was an UNRWA director in the 1950s who thought maybe we should build permanent housing for the Palestinians. Maybe we should talk about resettlement. He didn't last long in the job, Shahar. That was not the goal. The goal of the Arab world, and those who in a way cheered on the Arab world, was to use this refugee population as a weapon against the new state of Israel. Had they been mingled into the other populations, you speak about Darfur, or for that matter, how about displaced persons from the Second World War who still had not found homes? Had they been mingled there, they would have been lost. This became a very conscious, deliberate weapon to be used in the arsenal of those who sought to destroy the state of Israel. There were armies, there were terrorists, there were suicide squads, there were boycotters. This was one of the key tools. And I believe, Shahar, and I said it in the New York Post, but it's not a new point. Unless we can solve the UNWRA issue and the mindset it creates among, now, Shahar, there were several 100,000 on the caseload in the 1950s of UNWRA. Today, they count 6 million Palestinian refugees. Populations are supposed to decline because of death, because people move on, they resettle elsewhere. So instead of 600,000 or 700,000, we speak about 6 million. If this continues, Shahar, what will the number be in 10 years?
You're right.
And by the way, in the war of information, which goes on every day, critics of Israel, haters of Israel, use the number millions of Palestinians to describe what they believe to be the crime of Israel, without even understanding that the millions is a number that was created because of this situation, this definition, because Bella and Gigi Hadid could be counted in that 6 million. They are not the actual refugees. Yes, the refugees from West LA to Hollywood, or something.
Yeah, they're modeling refugees.
Yeah.
But you're talking about using this population as a bargaining chip, and it takes me back to thinking about what's happening in Lebanon.
As a weapon.
As a weapon. And even Palestinian population in Lebanon, which doesn't receive permission to integrate or even live within Lebanon or get, proper status or citizenship, and nobody cares about them, right? The BDS movement, they're not even mentioned by all of these guys. But there was one thing that you mentioned, you're talking about the negative role that UNWRA is playing in the international sphere. You are a veteran of the international sphere. This is not the first time we've heard about UNWRA's shenanigans and the negative role it plays. What happened now, David? What happened now that we reached such an important moment when we're having this discussion, where you publish your op-ed in the New York Post? By the way, highly recommended. Take this as a reference point. It's important to understand this background because there is a lot to do. What happened now, in your opinion, that really made this issue into what it is now, so pertinent, so timely, so important to deal with, and so many countries finally pulling funding out of UNWRA?
Let me just piggyback on your reference to Lebanon for a moment to stress the point you made. The only Arab country that I'm aware of that has given citizenship in any serious way to Palestinians displaced by war, by conflict, is Jordan. In Lebanon, the Palestinian refugees, multi-generation, are restricted in their ability to buy property, face a kind of apartheid-like discrimination about where they can and cannot work, what professions they can and cannot work.
You heard that correctly, and that's real apartheid.
Right, and yet no one discusses it because Israel is not involved. How about the number of Palestinians who were expelled from Kuwait? After Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, occupied Kuwait, Palestinians cheered, including Yasser Arafat. When they were ousted, when Iraq was ousted, Kuwait responded by kicking out overnight hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. Not a word from the international community, nothing. So why now? Why UNWRA? Why Gaza? I think the answer is very simple, Shahar. Because Israel is there on every block, on every square meter. The evidence is overwhelming. It's incontrovertible. If you accuse one person somewhere from a distance, maybe, maybe not. But when you're there, when you actually have visuals, photographs, video, and you can identify UNWRA workers who are collaborating, when you have a petition or whatever it was signed by many UNWRA staff supporting Hamas, when you see the physical linkage between UNWRA facilities and the terror infrastructure, and you see it not once and not twice, but dozens, scores, maybe hundreds of times, even the most willfully blind at a certain point, Shahar, have to acknowledge this is not all staged by Israel. And so, big shout out to Germany. Germany was one of the very first countries. In our discussions, I've given shout outs to Germany before for its
Right.
consistent support of Israel since October the 7th. But Germany took a lead. We're suspending funding. The United States said we are suspending funding. The number of countries, mostly European, but also including Japan, Australia, New Zealand, has now grown, I think, close to 20 countries or thereabouts. They've come to understand, Shahar. They have no choice but to understand that they are funding the problem, not the solution. But now we come to another big question. Is this just temporary? Is this just the moment? Is this just a superficial? Or is this real? Is this a deep dive? And I want to state the obvious. Unless this ushers in a deep dive, the root and branch of what's wrong with UNWRA, then basically little will change. We'll go through the motions, some statements will be made, some apologies will be expressed, and
Right,
nothing will change.
Right. UNRWA already claimed that the 10 to 12 of its members that actually participated in the atrocities against innocent Israelis on October 7th, they've been, of course, expelled and their rights have been denied. But you're right. I mean, where are we going to go from here, really? How is that going to change for real?
So I think JBS viewers, among others, I hope will be in touch with their elected officials. If they're in the United States, then with their senators, their congressmen, with the White House, and make clear we welcome the suspension of U.S. assistance, we welcome the review of UNRWA, but we will not be satisfied unless it is a serious, thorough, long-term review of UNRWA. Otherwise, little's going to change. And if there are viewers watching through YouTube and other social media platforms overseas, the same. From Germany to Australia, from New Zealand to Britain. Those who want to solve the Arab-Israeli conflict, Shahar, those who want to see coexistence between Israel and Palestinians should take this issue seriously. I'm saying, I firmly believe that unless we can solve this issue of UNRWA, the chances of finding enduring Israeli-Palestinian peace diminish greatly, and they're not high to begin with. So if we're interested in peace, this is not just a talking point. This is not just a pro-Israel distraction. This gets to the heart of the issue.
You know, David, you mentioned, and I know we're almost out of time. I can't believe it. Where is time going through, slipping by our fingers?
There'll be a new dawn with a new Shahar.
A new dawn. The idea
despair.
of refugees at that time, you know, we didn't just have displaced people, you know, post-World War II. We also had refugees right here, you know, in the Middle East, in Israel. And I'm talking, of course, about Jewish refugees, some of whom you know very personally. And I wanted to ask you, how were the Jews disregarded in such a way? And where have all of the Jewish refugees gone to? Maybe say a few words about that.
Look, the first thing I'd like to say, Shahar, is I'm very sympathetic to refugees, period. Any refugee who's displaced, who has to leave their home with their family, with their children, who has to start over again. How do I know? Because my mother was a refugee not once but twice, from communism and then from Nazism. My father was a refugee, and my wife, the one you were referring to, was a refugee from the Arab world. From the Arab world.
Right.
So Palestinian refugees are not unique.
Libya, right?
Libya.
Yep.
They're not unique. I don't say this in any way to minimize whatever suffering or trauma they may have experienced. Not at all. I'm very sympathetic. We all should be to refugees. But on the other hand, Shahar, the notion that there is only one refugee population in the world, that there was never a refugee population before or since. The only thing on the minds of students on campuses, the only things on the mind on protesters in Times Square or in discussions in the city council in Chicago or Oakland, California, is one refugee population is shocking, shockingly unfair and unjust. My wife and her family lived in Libya, or on Libyan soil, I should say, long before, Shahar, listen carefully, the Arab invasion, the Arab conquest, and the Arab occupation of Libya. Where do Arabs come from? They come from the Arabian Peninsula, thousands of miles away from North Africa. What are they doing in Morocco, in Tunisia, in Algeria, and in my wife's Libya? But Jews, as we know, were forced to leave Libya. There's not one Jew left in Libya, not one. There's not a trace of Jewish life there. Nothing, Shahar. But you know, they moved on. They didn't want to become wards of the international community. They didn't want to become dependents of the international community. They were traumatized. I know that my wife was 16 and a half years old, Shahar. She was not a little baby. She lived this very, very personally with 7 siblings and her parents. But they moved on. As my wife, when she told the story on JBS, when they finally were given safe passage to Italy, my wife was not even 17 years old. Within 3 days, she went to work. Her older sister went to work as well to help the family. They had a sense of pride and dignity. We're going to make it. We're not going to give up. We're not going to wallow in victimization or self-pity. Life is unfair. We've been treated unfairly. It hurts, but we move on. This is what we as Jews believe. We move on. We look to the future. And that's exactly what they did. And Israel opened its doors to Jews from the Arab world. And other Jews moved to France and to Italy and to the United States and to Latin America. They moved on. But, as my wife said, maybe that was their mistake. Because by moving on, the world never paid attention to them. Instead, the obsessive attention is focused on Palestinians, 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 as if they were the first, the last, and the only refugees, as if there were no solution in terms of resettlement, even in the Arab world. Why doesn't Lebanon open up, a fellow Arab country, same language, same religion, same culture, same music, same foods?
Right.
Why doesn't it open up? Why doesn't it extend citizenship? Why doesn't it allow Palestinians to buy property? Why doesn't it allow Palestinians to work in all the sectors and contribute to the society? Why? Where are the questions? Why is it we who are asking the question, Shahar, and not the international community? So as we speak, if the UN is being forced to start to ask these questions, good sign. But our job collectively, JBS audience, is to make sure that we keep pressing with the questions and aren't satisfied with short, simple, glib answers.
You know, David, your wife and the other 850,000 Jewish refugees from Arab lands and beyond, by, taking responsibility for their lives, they are leading by example. They're a source of great inspiration for all of us. And I wouldn't trade places with the Palestinians, not even for 1 second. But I really want to appreciate and uphold and really make sure that our viewers paid attention to what you just said, your very poignant analysis of the problem, but also the way for a solution, which means that not only can we, but we must speak up, say, demand our international community, our leaders, our elected officials, to do something, to change reality on the ground for the better, and that's the only way forward. I can't appreciate enough the important points that you're making, and especially this one, David. Thank you so much.
And I want to stress, for the better, not just for Israelis and Jews, but for Palestinians. The only way forward to create a different environment, coexistence, prosperity, and peace is for all of us to tackle this issue. It's not just for Israel. It's for the future dignity and respect of the Palestinians themselves. UNWRA suppresses it.
Right.
Unleash the energy, unleash the creativity, unleash the power, and let's build a new Middle East, starting with Israel and its neighbors.
Indeed. Just for true hope. It goes back to the point of who's truly pro-Palestinian. David, it's always such a pleasure, a joy, and an inspiration. Thank you so much for your incredible words. And I always end, we always end in the same way. These are trying times for all of us. The only way we can get through them is together you and I, and together for all of us with our JBS viewers and our viewers across the world on all of the different platforms. May we be inspired by your call to all of us to take a stand and to do. Thank you very much for this.
Thank you, Shahar. Am Yisrael
And
Chai.
may we all see better times soon. And indeed, Am Yisrael Chai. Thank you so much, David. Looking forward to speaking soon.